when I learned what A Little Romance was about, I was very, very keen to see how the Golden Girls would handle this. Because on the one hand, it was released in the 1980s, but on the other, the Golden Girls doesn't really seem to be offensive at any point. It seems to handle potentially sensitive topics really well. And I'm pleased to say this episode is amazing, with some really, really funny moments. One that made me genuinely laugh out loud. This is the 13th episode of the first season of The Golden Girls. It's directed by Terry Hughes, and there will be spoilers from now as I go through the episode and talk about things that I really thoroughly enjoyed. So the intro actually had me a little concerned because Sophia's getting ready to go and visit Phil, her son, and I did worry for a moment that it meant she wouldn't be in the episode very much, but thankfully everything worked out well there. And what I love about this, and this is something that I've mentioned before, Golden Girls seems to do things really well and break the mold in several ways. And with this one, Phil's wife is a welder, which is amazing, because this is the 80s and welding is typically seen as a man's job. Even today, I'd still feel like that's still an unfair assumption. And her grandson is graduating from animal grooming school, which is not exactly seen as a masculine profession. That today in a sitcom would be pretty great. But in the 80s, that's fantastic. But they don't make a big deal of it. It's the facts. And I really appreciated that. We then get the main narrative established. And Rose has been dating somebody she's kind of nervous to introduce to the others, and it's because he is short. And I was going to say she finally agrees, but she says she'll invite him over eventually. Blanche kind of did it behind her back, and he arrives, and things are a little awkward, but in a way that's definitely making fun, mostly at Blanche, and how Blanche responds to things, because he knocks on the door, she opens the door, and she says, and I did laugh at it because I didn't expect her reaction. She says, "No thank you, little boy," and a couple of other things, and shuts the door. She just doesn't even acknowledge that this could be Rose's partner. And Dorothy goes back to the door, and he explains that he is Dr. Jonathan Newman. He's played by Brent Collins. And Dorothy replies, "Are you absolutely sure?" And I just found that to be very, very well delivered. And I will say the comedy in this is basically all not poking fun at his height, but rather at the way other people respond to the situation. And they're very aware that they're reacting in ways that aren't appropriate. And I have some examples of that, but it's really, really well done. And one of my favourite moments is when a couple of them are in the kitchen and Blanche comes out and says, and all she says, referring to the food, "shrimp." That's it. And there are so many references to small and short and little, but it's all cleverly woven in, and it's just so well written. Blanche is also very, very apologetic because she keeps slipping up, not intentionally. And one of my favourite things about this is Dr. Newman's attitude, because obviously he's heard it all before. And he points out to Rose that Blanche is very uptight, and he says, and I quote, "I'm going to have fun teasing her." And I love that. He's not getting offended by these accidental slip-ups. He's just going to lean into it and have good fun and milk the situation for what it's worth. And I think that that's the best attitude to have. And he actually gives this great little speech at one point about how he's happy with who he is. But we all have things about ourselves we'd want to change. That's normal. That's perfectly fine. But at the same time, it's best to just accept who you are, and that's exactly what he does. And as somebody, I think Dorothy, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was Dorothy who pointed out, he just has the best attitude, and it's an attitude we should all have. And that's something that I really, really loved about how that character was written. And then Sophia comes back, and we are given a reason for why she's come back early, and you could feel the tension. Everybody could sense that Sophia, if anybody is going to say something offensive, it's going to be Sophia. And this is the bit I howled laughing at. I actually rewound it a little bit and watched this bit again, not because of what she said, but because of the reaction of two of the others. She walks up to Dr. Newman and she says, "I hope this doesn't sound rude. cut to Blanche and Dorothy looking incredibly terrified. It's fantastic. That moment, I cried laughing at. It was so, so funny. And then she says something not offensive. She just says something, I can't remember exactly, but she just says, I'm tired, I've travelled, I need to go and rest, and it was fantastic. And then she had a very funny line about thinking she was having a stroke, which doesn't sound funny, but within the episode it really was. And then after that evening, Dr. Newman asks Rose to dinner, and Rose begins to wonder or assume that he's going to ask her to marry him. And she doesn't know how she feels about that. And after some encouragement from the others, she goes to lie down, and then she has a dream. Now, I'm not really a fan of dream sequences. I don't find them that interesting. So I didn't love that part of this, but it had a good message in it. Because in the dream, we have Rose in a wedding dress. We also have Billy Barty playing a character who represents Rose's father. Rose's father isn't actually short in real life, but Billy Barty's version is. And the point there is that Rose never saw her father as short because she loved him and cared about him. And you don't see those things in people when you really care about them. And that's a really beautiful message, a very creative way to tell that point, but it worked very well. We also have a character in this called Jeane Dixon, who was apparently a well-known psychic at the time, which I feel like was really random. Maybe it meant more at the time. I assume it would have done, but within the episode, it didn't really add anything. And maybe it would have been funnier at the time, but I didn't find that to be necessary. I didn't feel like it added anything to the narrative. So I don't know, that bit I didn't care too much for. But then we have the dinner, and we actually have a bit of an interesting performance from Rose here. As it turns out, he wasn't going to propose to her. Dr. Newman decided to break it off with her. And the reason for this is because she isn't Jewish. And I thought, well, my main thought was, surely you knew she wasn't Jewish when you started to date her. If that's something that's really important to you, why would you start to date somebody when you know they're not Jewish? For example, if Rose thought she couldn't ever date somebody who was as short as Dr. Newman, why would she start dating him? And it just confused me that a man who was clearly intellectual decided to begin a relationship with somebody he knew there'd be no future with anyway. I don't know, maybe he thought he could overlook it, but ultimately decided he couldn't. But I feel like something as important as that is something you'd be aware of beforehand. But either way, never mind. Rose has an outburst in the restaurant. It lasts a couple of seconds, but it's a side of Rose we don't normally see. Rose doesn't normally show her emotions very strongly, certainly not negative emotions, and it worked very well. And it was a pretty decent way to end the episode. I figured it wasn't going to be a marriage proposal, because that was too obvious. It was too obvious that that's what was going on. But to break it off because she isn't Jewish, I definitely didn't predict that. So, a very interesting episode with some very, very funny moments, some great performances, and ultimately it handled the topic well. And I think the main reason it worked well is because Dr. Newman had such a great attitude, and he was a brilliant character. And I think they did a great job with it. So, needless to say, it's a brilliant episode, and one that I think they did very, very well with.